I think they inspired so much of the youthfulness of the music that I loved so much. Like, I mean, I think that all of the music that I loved of like 60s pop in particular felt very much like, and once I kind of grew older and sort of looked at sort of the history of it, like it was clear that the Beatles and their boyishness and their kind of just like pure, like kind of youthful joy in a lot of their early music especially is so prevalent in how so many other 60s pop artists kind of modeled themselves and molded themselves off of it.
Youngsters from Liverpool, England.
The Beatles have held this title for 8 years.
My model of business is the Beatles. You know, they were 4 very talented guys.
Welcome back to the Here, There, and Everywhere podcast. I'm your host, Jack Lawless. Thank you all for your continuing support. I'm so glad you're all enjoying these episodes. Now, if this is your first time listening, go ahead and make sure you subscribe so you get notifications when each new episode comes out. Today, I'd like to introduce a very special guest on the show, Brittany Spanos. Brittany is a senior writer at Rolling Stone, where she covers music, fandom, and pop culture. She is also a podcaster, a Rolling Stone cover story specialist, and she loves boy bands, and in this case, specifically the Beatles. Hey, Brittany, thank you so much for coming on the Here, There, and Everywhere podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
How are you doing today?
Good. It's very sunny here, enjoying the warm weather. So yeah, things are good. How are you?
I'm doing well. I just saw Ringo perform a concert last night with his all-star band, which is phenomenal. And I'm seeing Paul perform next week in New Jersey.
Nice.
So I'm getting my Beatles fix for the decade. And I hear you're going to London pretty soon to go on a Beatles trip.
Hopefully, yeah. I'm going to London for work in a week. And I have been looking up some tours to do there because I have some pockets of time during the day that I can go do some like fun touristy stuff. And I've been to London. This will be my 3rd time, and I have not been to like the Abbey Road, like Beatles crosswalk yet, or haven't done any like music stuff there. So I'm hoping that this will be the time that I can finally do it. So I've been looking up some like music tours, and there's a day one that takes you to Liverpool, and you can go to the museum there and all that. So
that sounds fantastic.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so happy for you. So when did you first hear the Beatles music? What was your life like at that time?
I first heard the Beatles probably when I was super, super young. I spent a lot of time with like my grandpa would play like the oldie station a lot. So like I would listen to like a lot of like, 50s and 60s rock and pop music, and I just like really loved it. Like I was very much requesting it when I was like 3 or 4. I was like put on that station. And of course, like, a lot of especially the earlier Beatles hits would be on there. So like I Want to Hold Your Hand and kind of like the very kind of like Love Me Do, like very, very early Beatles songs would be played on those stations a lot. So I loved all of that music. Like I loved that kind of like, 60s pop sound, 60s Brit pop sound, and was really obsessed with it. So that's probably the earliest I listened to the Beatles, but my grandpa like actually hated the Beatles.
Oh, no way.
He I don't know. He was a little conservative, so he was just like, John Lennon's a dirty commie, and like I didn't know what that meant, but I was like, sure, grandpa. And like, he just like really, I don't know. He seemed to have a lot against the politics of the Beatles for some reason. We never actually talked about it too much, but he just like seemed to really hate them. But I still really like them, and I like their music, and yeah, I listened to them throughout my childhood, and I think a big turning point for me was actually the Across the Universe film, and getting really into the Beatles after like getting more immersed into the Beatles and the music and who they were, and kind of hearing those songs in a different light really brought me back into learning a lot about them.
How old were you when you saw that movie?
Oh gosh, whenever it was in theaters first. So like, God, what year was that?
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with when that came out. Maybe like the early 2000s or so?
Yeah, I think so. I had to have been in like high school or junior high. I'm just going to look up the year real quick. 2007. So I was 15. Yeah, so that was 15 when I saw that movie.
2007. Okay, so that's like 2 years before the Beatles catalog hit the iTunes store and became available in the internet era. When that happened, did you find yourself more interested in the Beatles as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think like I was buying a lot of CDs. So I like was a really big sort of like, by the time that movie came out, I was sort of in this phase of my life. I mean, phase, like it's still part of my life, but like where I was learning about music history and like really kind of, I don't know, just like buying a ton of music history books. I was going to CD and record stores all the time. I was a huge CD buyer. And so, you know, I had an iPod and I loved buying music and I loved like downloading music, but I was really, really into buying a lot of CDs. And so like I had like a ton. So I remember I did buy like the Beatles 1 album. And so I had that. And that was a good like square one introduction to the Beatles and to like knowing obviously the bigger hits and all of that. And so even before they were on iTunes, I had bought a few of the CDs prior.
So what was it about them that roped you in?
I mean, I love pop music and I love really good, catchy, you know, love songs, heartbreak songs, kind of very, just like the simplest parts of what makes really great and universal pop music. And I mean, that's what reeled me into the Beatles in the beginning, like when I was a kid. And that's what I loved about like 60s pop music generally, was like, it was just simple. Like it was just kind of straightforward. I loved harmonies. I loved all of that stuff. And obviously the Beatles are very much a square one boy band, and boy bands have been a very big part of my life for many years. So, you know, soon after that early kind of childhood introduction to a lot more classic music is when NSYNC and Backstreet Boys blew up. And that's when I got really into them. And of course, there are so many through lines from the Beatles to where we were with like, you know, NSYNC and the Backstreet Boys and later boy bands. So yeah, I loved, and you know, they just like are cute. And obviously, you know, wasn't like in that, like, you know, I feel like if I lived through the 60s, I probably would have been one of the many screaming girls at any of those concerts. Like I know for a fact I definitely would have been. So yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is very much a lot of the basis of what I love about pop music and the type of pop music that I still really love.
You've been so interested in music since such an early age.
Yeah.
How did you wind up working for Rolling Stone later on in life?
I decided I wanted to work at Rolling Stone when I was 12. I made that like executive decision for my life. So I was in this, like, by the time that I'd seen Across the Universe and gotten into it, like I was in this like very much period of like really doing a lot of immersive music history education for myself. And just because I loved history even before I really found that I loved music history. And it's kind of the same thing that happens when you're a fangirl. Like you like really want to know everything about the artist that you love and like need to know like the entire history, everything that they love. And so I had that with me when I was like a huge fan of NSYNC and when I was like, you know, 7, 8, 9 and like obsessed with Justin Timberlake. But then as I got older and I was, you know, reading more books and like reading, you know, like learning, like I can like buy like a huge book on like Led Zeppelin and like learn about them, or like Green Day. And I would just like, you know, be like, okay, what kind of music does like Billie Joe Armstrong like? And then I would listen to all those bands. Like it was just kind of a constant sort of evolution of, you know, I became obsessed with an artist and I would be like, who do they like? And what do they listen to? What inspires them? Like what makes them tick?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I had like a Led Zeppelin moment, and I read Hammer of the Gods way younger than a person should read Hammer of the Gods. And I like read that book, and then I found out that it was like, you know, that Cameron Crowe's some of his time with Led Zeppelin semi-inspired Almost Famous, and I was like, gotta watch that movie. And then I watched Almost Famous, and I was like, holy shit, like you could just make a job out of this. So I was like, you could have like a whole career where you're just like a huge music nerd, and that's so cool. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to work for Rolling Stone. And I subscribed to Rolling Stone and Spin Magazine around the same time. And it just, yeah, it made sense after that. Like everything just seemed to fall into place and click for me.
Has working for Rolling Stone brought you deeper into the Beatles universe? Have you crossed paths with any Beatles yet? Have you found yourself digging deeper and doing more research on the Beatles since working there?
Yeah, I mean, I've always, like, I feel like they've definitely just been a constant in terms of, like, a comfort soundtrack to my life. But, yeah, I've seen Paul McCartney once. I haven't seen Ringo. I would love to see Ringo. And obviously spending time with a lot of people who are even more knowledgeable about the Beatles, like Rob Sheffield, of course, and, like, his book, Dreaming the Beatles. And, you know, like Andy Green, and like I was just like an Angie Bartosio. Like all my coworkers are such huge Beatles fans, so I've learned a lot from them as well, and have gotten to kind of like enjoy different sides of like why they love this band. And but yeah, like I've been able to like covering like a Paul McCartney concert was like a big moment for me, and that happened before I was at Rolling Stone. It was before I was at Rolling Stone when I was at the Village Voice and I reviewed it, and it was like a really big moment because I was just like, this is like an artist that I never thought I would get to see. Like it was like one of those like kind of like pinch me moments of being a music journalist where I had been covering so many, you know, like younger, really young acts, new acts, like really big, you know, like really like local type of music and everything. So to cover someone that big was kind of wild to me, because I was just like, this is just like someone that like everyone in my life knows who this person is, like, right. You know, and it's just like kind of crazy to be at this concert. And so like seeing him live was like a big sort of moment of like, I can't believe this is like what I get to do for work.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. How was the concert?
It was really good. I think it was like, the concert was like in 2013, I think, either 2013 or 2014. And so I was at the Village Voice then, and I remember I was at Barclays Center, and I only got one ticket because he was very famous and I was a new writer, so they weren't like, here's a +1. And so I went alone, and it was honestly the best experience because I was sobbing so hard the entire time. Like I was having the best time. Befriended like this group of women next to me who were just like best friends, like lifelong best friends. And, you know, they were all like, you know, super Paul girls, like who had grown up listening to them. And, you know, it was like really sweet to kind of become a part of their night together. You know, they're like girls' night out, where they like kind of like folded me in as like, I was like 21 or something at the time. And I was just like, can I just like, you know, hang out with you guys? And they were very, very sweet. And that was really nice. And it's just like such a good show. I mean, it just sounds amazing live. And, you know, it was just being able to hear all those songs live for the first time was completely surreal. Like just like songs that I had just been hearing almost the entire time I've been alive.
So that was 2013 at the Barclays Center. I'm pretty sure I was at that exact concert as well.
Yeah, I think it was 2013. It was because I was working at I was working at the Village Voice from like 2012 to 2014. So it was sometime in that frame, and I'm pretty sure it wasn't 2012.
Oh, we were probably at the same concert. Oh, it was so good, wasn't it?
It was just like such a surreal moment to be able to see him live.
Is Paul your favorite?
Okay, I was a George girl growing up because I just thought he was so mysterious, and he just seemed like, you know, kind of like just like sweet, and like, I don't know. He seemed to not be with a lot of the drama of the band, at least like from my perspective at that time. Like obviously I know, like especially after seeing like Get Back and everything, I'm like, okay, my perspective was not the correct one on this. But I thought he was just like hot, and I love Ringo. I just find him delightful. I love Ringo songs, and you know, I like also have like an affinity his song that's She's 16. I mean, like, it's like
a... Oh, yeah.
That's a different conversation. But, like, my grandpa used to sing a version of that was, like, She's Brittany. Like, she's Brittany. She's mine. Like, he used to sing that to me when I was a kid. So I was, like, really, like, I've always had a fondness for Ringo because of that song. Which is also funny because my grandpa, like, you know, like I said, he kind of, like, hated the Beatles. So it was funny that was the song that he remixed to sing about me. But, like... yeah, it's, you know, I've always had a fondness for Ringo, and I've always found him like very cute. But I honestly, like, everyone after watching Get Back, I was like, I kind of really, really love Paul even more. Like, I just thought he was just like kind of like, he's kind of a bitch, and I really like that. Like, I don't know, I just thought he was like, I just was endeared to it. Right. I was like, you know what, whatever. Like, I'm cool with it. Like, I think this is kind of like a nice side of Paul.
Was he a good kind of boss, or was he just kind of annoying?
I thought he was kind of a boss bitch. Like, he just like, you know, he was a little annoying, but like it was for a good purpose. Like, there was a greater purpose to why he was annoying. Like, he wasn't annoying for the sake of being annoying. And I respect that.
Now, is he the cutest as well?
he's cute. He's definitely, I mean, they're all cute, but like George was definitely like, George was the hot one to me in my ranking, my definitive rankings of Beatles hotness and how I listen to them. George was the hot one.
Brittany, how have the Beatles influenced your life?
Ooh. Gosh, I don't know. I mean, I think like in terms of how it shaped my thinking about maturity in pop music, I would say that the Beatles have shaped a lot of that. They've been very influential in the way that I've thought about how bands, especially really young artists, kind of grow in the industry and how they sort of, I think they were the blueprint for a lot of people in terms of like what it meant to mature in pop music. Mm-hmm. And like my favorite Beatles album is Rubber Soul, and I think that's like such a great example of what it means to sort of like move from teen idol sort of phase of your life and of your career to this like more mature kind of like wanting to be taken more seriously in a different light. And I feel like that album is such a good sort of blueprint for so many artists in that way. And I think that I've used them sort of like as the basis for how I've thought about maturity in pop music over the years. But in a personal way, like I think like I love, you know, they made music that was just purely universal and joyful. And I think that's just like the most important part of making any sort of pop music, of any sort of genre of music. But, you know, I think that is so respected by them. And I think sometimes, you know, criticism and music criticism and the way that we think about authenticity in music forgets that sometimes at the very core, it is just meant to be fun and, you know, just kind of meant to have that mass appeal sometimes. And the Beatles achieve that, you know, they like achieve that in like the best possible way. And, you know, we can look at them as geniuses, which I think they all were, but like, you know, I also think that they were geniuses because they were able to make music that was at its core very, very sweet and simple and pleasant. Like that's just kind of a nice thing to do, and to be able to do it, you know, in a way that has completely affected so many generations is, I mean, just like such a thing to marvel at. Like there are still really young kids who are discovering the Beatles for the first time and feeling that appeal and affinity for them that, you know, I did when I was a really young kid.
And what characteristic of their music allows that to happen? Like when you were a kid and you were listening to that radio station playing 50s and 60s music, did the Beatles music stand out to you? Or did it just kind of blend together with all of the pop that was on the radio?
I think they inspired so much of the youthfulness of the music that I loved so much. Like, I mean, I think that all of the music that I loved of like 60s pop in particular felt very much like, and once I kind of grew older and sort of looked at sort of the history of it, like it was clear that the Beatles and their boyishness and their kind of just like pure, like kind of sheer kind of, you know, kind of youthful joy in a lot of their early music especially is so prevalent in how so many other 60s pop artists kind of modeled themselves and molded themselves off of it. And so that was what I always loved about it, because it just felt so young and fresh, even though, you know, I was like in 3, 4, 5, whatever. Like I had no idea like that it was like from decades prior. Like it just sounded so sweet and fun. Like it could have also been playing on Radio Disney, like, which I was also like toggling between, you know, like it could have been, you know, from Lizzie McGuire, and I didn't know the difference. Like it was just like, it felt like young and sweet and just like completely fresh in that way, because it is that universal tone to it. It is that sort of like the concepts are as, you know, as now as they were then. Like, you know, it's like, I Want to Hold Your Hand is such a simple phrase and such a simple song. And it's like, you know, that could in theory be written today, you know, just like the lyrics and the tone of it. There's nothing about it that feels dated.
Oh yeah. I think if you were to play I Want to Hold Your Hand by the Beatles followed by Beautiful Soul by Jesse McCartney, either on a playlist or like on Radio Disney, it would sound contemporary. It would
absolutely
sound
could.
like they were not made 50 years apart from each other.
Yeah, She Loves You is totally a One Direction song. Like,
yes,
all of these things are like they could have just, you know, that obviously they are the ones that had so brilliantly written them, but like those songs sound like they could very much have come out today.
Do you have a favorite memory that's associated with the Beatles?
Oh, I mean, other than the Paul McCartney concert, which is like such a special memory that I hold dear. Gosh, I don't know. I mean, it's like, again, like one of those artists that I feel like so many people in my life I kind of have connected with them through, like, you know, like there's just like one of those bands that's just like so many people in my life really, really love and like have like really like core memories associated with it. You don't realize like how special that is until like you kind of are thinking really hard on. You're like, oh yes, I have so many friends in my life who like are huge like Beatles fans in a way that like you wouldn't expect them to kind of share that. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think I've always loved kind of doing Beatles karaoke with friends. Like I think that's always kind of like such a sweet moment of realizing that we have these like same relationships with the songs or same ways that we were introduced to the Beatles. Yeah, I have like several other friends who kind of like had a similar moment of like Across the Universe is like a moment for them that they like were like, oh wait, I really love this band. And so I've heard like Oh Darling at karaoke a lot in a way that I think, you know, like other generations of fans would be surprised to like hear so many like like late 20s, early 30s people like singing Oh Darling, having that be their like Beatles karaoke song of choice. And it's because we all like saw Across the Universe in like theaters on opening weekend, you know?
Right, yeah. Are there any songs that you have special connections with?
I've like so many. Like I said, Rubber Soul is my favorite album, and I've always really loved Drive My Car because I just think it is like one of the greatest pop songs of all time. And I just like, I mean, maybe this is why I love how like Diva Paul and like Get Back, but like I just love that the girl's like an absolute diva in the song. Like I just like, I don't know, the way the women in Beatles songs are just like such heroes. Like they're just kind of like a little mean to them, and like they still love them. And like Drive My Car is like such a good catchy song, and I've always like, I play that album on repeat a lot, and I love that song so much. And I mean there's just like nothing more powerful than the na 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 of like Hey Jude. That's just like, I mean, that is like pop perfection. Like that is like top tier sing along, like gets my heart racing anytime I hear that in a public place. Like I think that was the moment I sobbed the hardest during the Paul McCartney show. I was like, I cannot believe I'm like singing along to this in like an arena full of people right now. Like that's insane. And oh gosh, I don't know. I think like there's just so many. Oh Darling for sure, definitely is still like a really great one for me. Something is like, I think one of the best love songs I've ever written. And gosh, I don't know, there's like no like bad Beatles song. You know, like there's no songs I listen to that I like really hate. Like even like the really, you know, like the kind of, you know, Maxwell Silver Hammer and stuff like that is like so fun to me. But yeah, I don't know. I have like such like, I feel like I'm like running through different memories with like all these different songs of like karaoke nights and like car sing-alongs and stuff. And with a little help from my friends, again, like as a Ringo fan, like I just love that performance. And I love a friendship song. I love a song about the guys. Like it's just like a sweet song.
So you say Rubber Soul is your favorite Beatles album.
Yeah.
Is that because of the songs on that album, or is it because of the context of what was going on during their career when they released that album?
The songs first. You know, I mean, I feel like all my introductions to like Beatles stuff is so like random, but like I got really into that album because I was a huge fan of the disco fan, and their album Pretty Odd, their much maligned album Pretty Odd, which I think is a very good album, is heavily inspired by Rubber Soul, and I was like, I gotta check it out. And I absolutely fell in love with Rubber Soul. It's obviously much, much better than Pretty Odd, but I just like, I don't know, I just really love that album. I just find it to be just like so good. And it's, again, like it feels like very comforting to me. There's a warmness to the production and to the songwriting. And I really think it's just like such a great album. And I think the context has grown more significant to me over the years, especially as I've begun to write more about pop music and begun to write more about like teen pop music and teen idols in particular. And like, you know, kind of watching and observing a lot of artists kind of make that transitional moment in their careers where they are moving to a more mature sound or more kind of like, you know, quote unquote, like adult sound. You know, obviously the Beatles were like a touch younger than a lot of those artists are now when they're doing that. But I think that album kind of is a good representation of like what that did for them and like how that's sort of been mimicked and kind of, I don't know, inspiring over the years in terms of that moment of kind of changing and shifting the tone of your career.
I'd love to get your take on this. I've asked Angie about it, and I've asked Rob about it. So the Phil Spector version of Let It Be.
Yeah.
Do you prefer that, or do you prefer the Let It Be Naked record?
Ooh, I mean, like, I hate saying anything like pro Phil Spector, but the Phil Spector version is really like so good. I mean, it's just like, you know, he sucks as a person, but like his production was very, very good. So that
So
is,
you're a fan of the orchestration.
yeah, the more lush the better. Like, I love that. So I mean, yeah, I'm a big fan of that version.
That's awesome. I'm very happy that you voiced a very controversial opinion.
I'll tepidly stand in the pro Phil Spector in this case only aisle.
So do you have any other controversial Beatles opinions? Any underrated albums or songs that you think deserve more credit than they're getting?
I mean, I don't know. I feel like I'm always kind of, it's not even controversial anymore to call them a boy band, but like that is something I will literally die on that hill. Like, I've gotten to many arguments at parties over, like, people do not, like, it's one of those things where you just can't bring up to me after a certain point of the night. Like, will scream about it for hours, but like, they are a boy band. There's no questioning that. That's not even that controversial anymore, because I think a lot more people are kind of like, yeah, now, but it was controversial for a minute, and I will stand by it.
What's the argument against them being a boy band?
Because they play instruments, and it's like, okay, it doesn't make them any less of a boy. Guns N' Roses are a boy band. Like, all these bands are boy bands. Like, like at a certain point, you just have to like own up to it. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if I have any like super, super hot takes besides that one sometimes, depending on the crowd for it. But yeah, I don't know if I have any, like, I think there's a lot, like, I feel like my opinions have evolved over the years. Like, for a really long time, I didn't really care for the White Album. Like, I just like didn't really entirely get it. And it's an album that like I feel like it just like felt really bloated to me. And then I kind of like have returned to it as I've gotten older. I've been like, oh, I really love that. Like, I really enjoy that album. I think, you know, I feel like Rob is a big part of that. Like, Rob's writing on the White Album is like a big part of me kind of growing more in love with it. And yeah, like, I think that was kind of, that's what I like about the Beatles though, is like, I feel like there are just all these incredibly unique sides to them that, like, as I've grown, like, a lot of, other than like Rubber Soul maintaining its spot at number one, like, I feel like my kind of opinions of stuff have changed when it comes to them, and about like different songs and different, you know, albums and things like that. But I feel like that was like the biggest shift, was like me becoming like, oh, like, I do enjoy the White Album more than I realized I did.
Are you a fan of their solo work?
Yes, I feel like Ringo's solo work I haven't followed as much. Paul, I mean, like 70s Paul, I feel like I've been listening to a lot more lately of solo Paul. I feel like solo John Lennon I got into like pretty young. I mean, it was like one of those things where it was just like, I might have also been like a family rebellion, you know, again with my grandpa's deep hatred for him. I was like, let me listen to this. And so I got really into John Lennon, and I was like really into, like, I loved I was obsessed with Yoko Ono, and I just thought she was like the coolest. And like, I've always been like a very pro Yoko Ono. That was probably also my controversial opinion for a long time. But again, like public opinion has changed, but I was always very pro Yoko Ono.
Yeah. And
so I like was really into a lot of their work, obviously together, and a lot of John's solo work for a lot of my teen years. And yeah, I mean, I've been a fan of George Harrison's solo work as well. But I would say like John's I probably have listened to the most, and Paul's I've gotten into more over the last like maybe like 5-6 years. And you know, like listening to more like Wings, and a lot more of like solo Paul has been a big part of that. So
yeah, I hear you. I used to play John Lennon when I felt like I needed to rebel against something. You know, like I was playing Working Class Hero when I was 13 years old, as if I, you know, was a working class hero myself.
Yeah. Yeah, and like I was really obsessed with like the Roxy Music version of Jealous Guy. Like that was like my favorite song it's still one of my favorite songs, but like there was like a good year where it was like really just like going platinum in my headphones. I don't know why. I just like really love their version of it. So yeah, I was like, I really enjoyed that era. And I also think I got really, I think like his relationship to and with like David Bowie and like kind of a lot of that inspiration. Like I was a huge, and still I'm like a really big Bowie fan. Like that kind of led to a lot more like John Lennon research and, kind of into a lot of his solo work.
Do you have a favorite fact about the Beatles that some people may not know already?
Oh gosh, I don't know that I have as much like deep knowledge in the way that like Angie and Rob and Andy do with like a lot of Beatles stuff. I feel like I've always been, I think this is again like kind of related to like the Yoko stuff. Like I've always been really fascinated by the wives, like the Beatles wives, and so I feel like that's kind of where a lot of my I think I was always really fascinated by like the muses and the women and like a lot of like rock music who kind of were so much like might as well have been part of the bands, in the way that they kind of inspired it. So I feel like a lot of my research into them was like became more fascinated with Linda and like Yoko and like Patty Boyd. I was so obsessed with, like I still am. Like I just think she's so iconic. Like just like the love triangle between her, George, and Eric Clapton was just like really amazing. It's just like an incredible like rock and roll deep dive of like everyone sort of like dating each other. So
imagine that happening now. That'd be crazy.
It's so good. And she inspired two of the greatest songs of all time, Something and Layla. Like, I just think those are, like, that's all, if you never inspired another song, if you never dated another rock star, you inspired those two songs.
Yeah.
Like, that's incredible. Like, that's insane that those are the two songs that, like, someone, like, two people wrote about you. Like, that's wild. Like, I just obsessed with it. So, yeah, I was, like, really loved like all of the wives and girlfriends. That was like my big sort of like my big fascination, but also like all of them are just such a part of the music. Like it's like completely intertwined with everything that I love about the Beatles, which is the love songs. And like, I think they have all written some of the greatest love songs of all time. And it's like these women who have inspired that. I was also really obsessed with Beatles fanfic too. Like I just like, then that was like not like a teenage like fanfic reading thing. Like I was like, as I became older and I started researching a lot of like fandom stuff about the Beatles, I think like because I was such a Tumblr kid, like I forget that these things like weren't invented in my time. Like I was just like, I just found it so fascinating to like look into it and be like, oh yeah, there was like Beatles zines that these teen girls, like of course they were writing like horny fanfic about John and Paul and like making these like like drawing like erotic photos of them. Like it was just like really wild to me, but it's also just like of course they were, like why wouldn't they be doing that? So I did a lot of like, I like had done this presentation at a conference a couple years ago, or it was like more than a couple years ago, where I just like had like a bunch of just like erotic photos drawn by like girls of like the 60s on in front of just like real Marcus in the audience. I was like, here you guys go. here's a bunch of crudely drawn images of John and Paul. So that's something, I think that's something that maybe not as much people know about, is probably like how like the depths of horniness that was happening and how hard people shipped all the Beatles together, and people are still writing Beatles fanfic. That was the other fascinating part when I looked into it. There was still people publishing Beatles fanfic online and drawing horny photos of them together. I think that was really interesting. That's
got to be like the longest running fan fiction series in the world, right?
Has to be. Like, I don't think people were doing that much prior to them. Like, I feel like the Beatles might have been like the earliest band to kind of create that type of like, really just like horny fever for like teen girls in the way that we see with, One Direction and like BTS and like any sort of pop group now or any sort of artist now. Because I did a lot of that research was like on the Beatles and Led Zeppelin, because Led Zeppelin, there was a lot of like Robert Plant, Jimmy Page fanfic being written and zines being shared. And I just found it fascinating because it was just, I did not realize like how far that kind of went back. Like it just felt like such an invention of the internet to share that. But a lot of these these girls were having like clubs and meetings where they'd like they'd mail these zines to each other, and they would like kind of create these like really incredible, elaborate, horny stories about them, and like just like that was like what their fantasies on them hinged. And I think like also the politics of that existing in the 60s is also like super fascinating, just in terms of like where we were at in terms of gay rights. Like, I mean, it was like non-existent like at that point. Like, I think to think about how transgressive that is and like how they kind of like express themselves in that way is really, really fascinating, because again, that's like so common now. Like, that's such like a big part of all fandoms, is that you have like fanfic and you have like online fan art and all of that. And I just like did not realize how similar it was back then. So maybe that's my secret Beatles fact is that you can find a lot of horny content on them online if you would like to look for it.
Do you believe any of it? Do you believe in them? Do you ship Mick Lennon?
No, I don't think they dated. I know that there's like I guess they're like, are they I don't know. I feel like they're unverified with like John Lennon and was it their manager?
Brian
right?
Epstein, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So I like that. I'm like, sure, why not? Like, there was like the movie made about it too. Like, I'm like, yeah, sure. But I don't think John and Paul ever did anything besides like the circle jerk that Paul talked about. So, which when I saw that, I was so happy for every single girl that like was in the trenches in the 60s, like sending mail to other girls. And I was just like, you earned this. You earned this so many decades on. Like, I hope you all saw this and were so proud, because yeah, I hope one of them just shed a single tear. But I wish there was like a good archive for it, though. I think that stuff is like really, really fascinating. Just like what people were, how their fandom kind of like manifested. But yeah, there's not a lot of, you could find some of the older stuff online, but obviously not all of it scanned or saved or, archived or anything. So you can't, that's why I found out that there was so much new stuff, is because so much of it was being written still on like Wattpad and Archive of Our Own, all the places where like more modern like fanfic is existing. But yeah, I wish there was a greater archive of this. Please mail it to me if anyone's listening to it and they have it. I will archive it. I will scan it online. People need to know. They need to see it.
So what is it about the Beatles that allows fan fiction to still be written about them 60 years later? Paul McCartney is turning 80 years old this year. Yeah. And, he's not 23 anymore, but, teenage girls are still writing about him.
I think it's the same thing that's appealed to like both of us, is just like, it still sounds so fresh still. And, there's nothing about it. Like, so much of their music, like none of it's aged poorly. Like, it's just like, it's one of those things where it's like a lot of the music you could, again, like literally any of the artists that are popular now, if they released any of those songs, would be mega hits in the same way, and that's fascinating in and of itself. And it's just a tribute to how brilliant they were and how much they knew. Just like that kind of like, you don't need to overcome, especially more so in the early years, of course, when they started to experiment more. It was, like really just kind of building upon everything they had done before. But like in the early years, and what made them as famous as they became and as appealing as they were to, millions of fangirls across the world at that point, was just the simplicity of it, and just kind of that, like, I feel like those songs are being written to or for me, like, or about me, and I think that's kind of what every single male artist strives for now. I think that's what sort of is the appeal of so many teen idols now, and they did it so effectively. Like even like thinking, like, I think the Beatles like perfected what kind of was beginning to happen with like, like Buddy Holly, and sort of this idea of like, we're singing these songs are for you, my teen girl audience. But like, Elvis songs weren't really like that way. It was just like, it was mostly the pelvis that was like kind of like pulling it in. Like, it was just like that kind of like carnal energy. But like the Beatles had that mixture of like cute faces, like the, cute matching suits, and they were singing these like really romantic and sweet songs that sounded like they could literally be for you. Like, it's just
Yeah.
kind of like such a simple thing. And, you know, every single band, you know, every single boy band, every single, you know, male teen idol since then has, you know, tried to achieve that. And it's effective. You know, it's like a big part of what builds fandoms and kind of builds these fan armies and that loyalty and that devotion to them. And, you know, I think because the Beatles did it so effectively the first round, like that's also kind of what pulls in listeners as they, you know, continue to listen to it. They're like, I wish that, you know, like these songs, like, you know, are just like so beautiful. Like you know, it's hard to not be like pulled in and into the Beatles fantasy still with that.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, I'm always really fascinated by like how fan culture has evolved. And so seeing that there are still such like huge Beatles fans who are like Gen Z now, who are like on Twitter making like Ringo fan cams and replying to like Pop Crave posts with it, is like really endearing to me. And also it does ultimately make sense. Like, how are you, like, there was a reason why Beatles mania existed, like why these, you know, why everyone was just like going wild and, you know, waiting for their planes to land and just like, you know, screaming until their voices were completely gone. Like, you know, that doesn't go away. Like, that doesn't stop being appealing. Like, even, I'm going to bring up Elvis again, like him being such like a teen idol too. Like, it is very fascinating to see what's happening now that Elvis is like back in the public conversation, because my TikTok is all Elvis right now. Like, it's my TikTok is all like, and I'm not even seeking it out. Like, it's like Austin Butler and people like being so charmed by him as Elvis, and also like people being fascinated by who the hell Elvis is and like why people loved him so much, and like also kind of being pulled into it. And, you know, but I think like there's a datedness to the sound of his music that's just a part of like when it was made and the production of it, and kind of a lot of that kind of country-ish tone in his voice, that southernness of like the kind of like retro country of him, like isn't as much a big part of pop music now in terms of like creating teen idols in the same way that it was kind of then and in certain pockets of history since then. But the Beatles, like, they just kind of, you know, sound like any sort of pop act that, and every pop act has imitated them since, which is why. But like, you know, they sound again like very much modern and forward in that production.
Speaking of that new Elvis movie that's coming out, what do you think of it?
I'm so excited to see it. It looks like such a mess. Yeah, like that. It's like, I love Baz Luhrmann though, so that's the other thing. Like, I'm a huge Baz Luhrmann fan, and it does look like kind of like a real kind of gaudy mess, and I think that makes sense for an Elvis movie.
Right.
But it's really fascinating. Like, you know, Elvis is someone that I think, you know, the Beatles, we have Paul and Ringo who are still carrying the torch, along with kind of, you know, being independently very, very famous and very revered as on their own. But like, of course, they're carrying the torch of the Beatles legacy with them as they go, and they are able to still perform and still kind of, you know, in a lot of ways continue to promote it for new generations, and be able to do things like, you know, like when Paul and Taylor were on the cover of Rolling Stone together, like that's like a moment where you're kind of seeing him sort of transcend generations. And, you know, like they both kind of perform with a lot of younger artists. They both have a lot of this like grander appeal and are able to kind of keep that legacy alive. Whereas like Elvis's legacy has been interesting, like not as like consistent in terms of public consciousness and like people caring as much, and younger generations caring.
Right.
He also, I don't know, just kind of sucked. Like, so that kind of doesn't help.
Yeah.
But it is really fascinating to kind of see him become, because I feel like there's like a lot of Elvis nostalgia when I was younger, and but also I feel like maybe that was just like me. I feel like that just might have been like me kind of like looking into like rock and roll history and my family and everything. But yeah, like it does feel like he was kind of not appealing as much to younger generations. So I'm kind of fascinated with what's going to happen next with that. But I think the movie, it sounds messy and fun, and I think it's going to be really big, and I'm very excited to see it.
When do you think we'll finally see a Beatles biopic, like an official Beatles from start to finish?
I don't know. I mean, I think like they're all so fascinating on their own, and it's hard to do something like that where you can really dig into those stories in a way that feels worthwhile without it feeling kind of bland. You know, all of their lives were so interesting, and I worry that like if there was a Beatle biopic, like it would focus like it would feel like it need to focus on one, right? Like we would get like majority Paul or majority John,
Right.
you know, and like I think it's not the best way to do it. Like I feel like if I got like a really good official Beatles biopic, like it would have to focus on a very specific time and place in the way that we kind of got with Get Back, right? Like, you know, like Get Back, I mean, I can't, like that is like such a perfect documentary and such like a perfect kind of like snapshot into this moment of the Beatles breaking up and like the end of the Beatles. Like that's like such a, I mean, it was so long, but so worth it. And it like, I don't know, for me, it felt like it flew by. Like, it was just, I was like, I would watch like 10 more hours of this. Like if they wanted to, if they wanted to drop that, like it's fascinating. Watch them being like dicks to each other and like also like make stupid jokes and Yoko looking bored. Like, you know, I was like, this is amazing. So I think if, you know, we got like a really good Beatles movie, like I'd want it to be like a really specific moment and time and place or year in their career, like kind of like, you know, maybe the polar opposite of Get Back, where it's like, you know, the first time they touched down in the US and like what that year in their life looked like, or, you know, kind of like maybe like a mid-career kind of moment. Like I can't imagine that like a full like classic start to finish biopic would work for them, because I'm like, they're just all, it's so hard to do band movies. Like it's so hard to do band movies without kind of choosing one person as like, we have to make this person the kind of star of it.
Right.
And so, yeah, I don't know. I feel like it would have to be like a 10-hour movie, or maybe it's just like Baz Luhrmann just kind of getting in there and making it go like 100 miles a minute, where it's just like we're just getting everything.
Yeah, with all the streaming services doing like weekly releases of documentaries or movies, you would think they would easily be able to do one about the Beatles, like make the first album the first week, second album the second week, etc.
Yeah.
But you know what, you're right, because it does get complicated with their individual personalities and what was going on in their own lives. It could be a lot to cover.
Yeah, and like I think like each of them had such interesting lives after too.
Yeah.
And like I think even some of the greater pool, but again, like this is why Get Back works so well, is because that is like such a fascinating moment for all four of them, like where they kind of have to reckon with the fact that they have been doing this for this amount of time and maybe it's just not going to work much longer. And that's kind of, you know, an incredible thing to see from any band. Like that's just like a raw thing to watch for people kind of deal with and you know, work through. But their lives after are just like also really, really fascinating. Like everything that they did after that is, you know, and I mean, just like it's kind of wild. Like I feel like it had to be like an anthology, like you mentioned, like an episodic, like an anthology or something, where we just kind of like get like, we're just watching the life story of this Beatle for 2 hours and you're going to see it from their perspective. Like I feel like that's the only way you could do it, because I feel like it would kind of end up being kind of cheap to watch it if it's just like trying to jump around like 2 hours of like trying to get the full life story of like all four of them, because they're all so fascinating and it's worth diving into the perspectives that they all had in the band and of the band.
Yeah. Hopefully within the next 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there has to be something. I know there's like something like an unofficial, like a weird one coming out at some point that does not look good. I feel like I saw pictures of them like filming something like.
Oh, right. Midas Man about Brian Epstein.
I think so. I was like, I don't know about this, but.
Yeah, I heard that casting did not go over well at all.
Yeah, I was like, I don't know. We'll see. But I feel like, I don't know. I think also, I mean, the way, again, that we've sort of been introduced and reintroduced to the Beatles, at least in like, you know, my lifetime. Like I think of like when I was really young, like not only we had Across the Universe, but like the Beatles' one album being as successful as it was, and like you know, the like Cirque du Soleil Love show, like there was like all these like other ways that people were kind of like learning the Beatles story just by like having the music used and reused and kind of seen as like this like malleable thing that can be attached to so many different stories. Like maybe that's just the most effective thing. Like maybe we just like need like a million more like kind
Yeah.
of like properties of that too, like kind of ongoing, where we kind of get all of these different ways that Beatles songs can translate to different forms of film and theater and art. Like I think that's also really fascinating because it works so well in all of those different modes.
Yeah, and I kind of learned the Beatles story on my own as soon as the Beatles came on iTunes, because their albums were in chronological order.
Yeah.
And it's kind of this really cool thing about how the Beatles songs can tell the story themselves.
Yeah.
If you listen to them in order.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's just like, so, I mean, there's such a universality to everything. And again, that's like part of the genius too. Like, it's just those songs can feel, as good and as new. And like hearing the Across the Universe version of I Want to Hold Your Hand completely felt like a totally new song, because it was just sung from a different person's perspective in like this very specific scene. Like it was, slower in the movie. Like it was just like a completely different song than, the way I had heard it when I was a kid. Like it just kind of brought a new life to it, where there was like a sadness to the song that I didn't have when I was like, listening to it in its original form. Or kind of just like hearing like Bono sing I Am the Walrus. Like it's just like, yeah, like that's like kind of like a really fun song. Like it's just like a great, like it's just like this like psychedelic like moment. It's just like all those ways those songs were able to kind of fit these narratives and these different stories told in this movie, like, and worked so well in each of those moments is just kind of incredible. I feel like there's like so many like jukebox musicals now for different artists, and it just is not the same in that way. Like the Beatles songs are just kind of, they exist in their own kind of like playing field of being able to do that.
Brittany, what have you been up to recently? Have you been working on any projects?
I currently co-host a podcast on internet culture called Don't Let This Flop. And I am writing the September cover story for Rolling Stone. So I'm working on that right now, and that will be out online some point in mid-August.
Oh, wow. That's exciting. Congratulations.
So check back in mid-August for what I'm working on.
I have one final question for you, Brittany.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you see the Beatles' music and influence in the next 50 and 100 years? And where do you see writers like yourself helping the public digestion of their music and interpretation?
I hope that, in the way that I just mentioned with like, Cirque du Soleil and like Across the Universe and all that, like I hope that we see like more of that in the future. Because again, like that is such a perfect way of delivering the Beatles music, because those songs can tell so many stories at once and tell so many different emotions at once. Like I feel like that's going to be such a beautiful way to see that music kind of grow and expand to new audiences, and for new generations to find new ways of discovering it. I think I love, like, I mean, we're seeing this right now with like Running Up That Hill by Kate Bush. Like I love seeing when like these moments of music discovery come from things that are, new in and of itself, and then all of a sudden like you're having a song that's like 3 decades old that kids are listening to as if it literally is their first time listening to it. Like it's just like it, and kind of feeling the way that so many other people have felt over decades of hearing those songs for the first time. And so I loved being able to hear Beatles songs for the first time and feel the way that I know many millions of young fans felt in the 60s, and like watching them on Ed Sullivan and like those like Top of the Pops and everything, like watching them have those like breakthrough moments, like to feel that repeatedly over decades is really inspiring. And I don't doubt that's going to keep happening for them. I think that people are going to keep discovering the Beatles in new ways, and I hope that we continue to see that music used in different forms and different types of media and different films and TV shows and musicals and all of that stuff. And I do hope that we can at some point get sort of the definitive story told in some way. I don't know what that'd be, but like I think there are so many brilliant books out there that so many incredible writers and authors have written. I think there are so many more to be written about the Beatles. Like there's an endless well of ways you can analyze and listen to their songs and learn about them and learn about their history. So I hope that's what writers continue to do, is kind of be able to tell their own kind of music, their love of music and their history with music through the Beatles, because they are such a square one. First, I know so many writers in my life who consider that to be their like earliest musical love, or, you know, the earliest thing that they were really obsessed with, even if it wasn't during the Beatles' heyday itself. So yeah, I think the Beatles have the privilege of being one of those bands, one of those few bands that kind of feel so eternal still. Like we are, you know, so many decades on. We're like 50, like how many years? Yeah, 50, 60 years on now? I don't even know.
Yeah,
I can't even
it's
count.
like 60 years.
That's insane. We're 60 years on. They're like, you know, kids whose grandparents are as old as the Beatles. Like they're kids whose grandparents weren't even like, you know, like conscious enough to even listen to the Beatles when they came out. Like that's insane to think about. And like, I think that's also, again, like a testament to who they are. Cause yeah, again, like I'm seeing like teenagers make fan cams to them, like, you know, like online, like it's gonna,
I love those, by the way.
I love them. So the Ringo ones are definitely my favorite, because he's just like so like he's so expressive and like so funny and does like really great facial expressions. So his like his fan cams are just like purely delightful, and it's very funny when it's paired with like, you know, like a City Girl song over like Ringo just drumming, you know, like it's just, it's very cute. And I think we're going to see more of that. I think we're going to see way more Beatles fan fiction in the future. And yeah, I mean, and I don't know. Also, again, like with Get Back to, like, I think that's going to be a film that's going to be a point of discovery for a lot of people. I think they're very smart to put that on Disney Plus. Like, I'm sure there are a lot of kids who, you know, are just going to have that streaming app for years, and, you know, go from watching like, you know, the kind of the cartoons to watching, you know, like more Marvel movies and being like, what's this? And like just end up watching like hours of these grown men just make, you know, stupid jokes and like fight with each other.
The real superheroes.
Yeah. And so many of those things are such great archives in and of themselves, where you can learn about it. Like there are so many music documentaries and like classic albums specials and behind the music specials that's how I learned about a lot of the bands that I love now. So I think that's going to continue being like a really special point of interest for future fans.
Yes, and I'm hoping we finally get a re-release of Anthology on streaming. I can't keep hanging on to my VCR for that much longer. Well, Brittany, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you for having me.
Youngsters from Liverpool, England.
The Beatles have held this title for 8 years.
My model of business is the Beatles. You know, they were four very talented guys.
And that brings an end to part 2 of our conversation with Brittany Spanos. Follow us on Twitter at BeatlesEarth and on Instagram under the same name. Be sure to follow Brittany at OhHeyBrittany and check out her Instagram as well.